By Johnny Cash here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On the second anniversary of the BP oil explosion and disaster that led to 11 deaths at least, 11 deaths of workers and 5 million gallons of oil released. We're joined in Doha, Qatar, from Al Jazeera studios by Dahr Jamail, who has been reporting extensively on the BP oil spill for Al Jazeera. And Abrahm Lustgarten is with us from San Francisco, author of a new book, Run to Failure, BP and the Making of the Deepwater Horizon Disaster. Abrahm, you speak about the executives who led BP. You talk about John Brown and Tony Hayward among them, how they managed it, how this was a catastrophe that could have been avoided.
Yeah, I mean, when you go back 15 or 20 years, it seems like a really long time, but that's where I found the roots of this story. And it started with John Brown, a former executive for BP, and his great ambitions to grow the company very quickly. He wanted to be the largest oil company in the world. He had a long way to go, and he did it by acquiring a number of companies, 7 in all, tens of thousands of employees, and also aggressively cutting costs. And while he did that, cutting costs in all of his operations and maintenance and so forth, his employees, whether in Alaska or Texas or elsewhere, were consistently complaining that it was forcing them to cut corners, that critical equipment wasn't being maintained, that there was a risk of oil spill or a risk of death, and those complaints were often ignored. Sometimes the workers even received reprisals for making them. And it took some years for the snowball to build, if you will, but by the early 2000s, BP really started having the kinds of troubles that its workers complained about. And John Brown kept pushing in that sense, even while oil was spilling in Alaska or refineries were blowing up in Texas. And that plus the acquisitions of these other companies kind of led to an internal culture without clear lines of communication, with an ethos of do whatever it takes to please the upper management, to make sure that the profits were there, no matter what happened. And there's a lot about the spill of the Macondo well and the Deepwater Horizon explosion that fits that same pattern. A lot of the poor decisions can only really be seen in the context of the fact that they sped up the process for BP. And so, you know, Tony Hayward didn't drive that, that cultural transition in BP the same way that John Brown did. He made a lot of moves to try to correct it. He said, as he became CEO in 2007, that the company needed a cultural transformation, but it doesn't appear from the circumstances that he was successful in achieving that in the years that he was CEO.
Abrahm, very quickly, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation the 2 catastrophes before, but I don't think people are very familiar with them. If you could explain once more what happened before BP's oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. This clearly wasn't the first time.
Of course. Yeah, the Texas City refinery, it's on the Gulf Coast just outside of Galveston, Texas. It's a sprawling plant, 1,200 acres, and it makes 3% of the United States gasoline supply. It's a very old, very outdated refinery. And at the time, there was some critical equipment that needed to be replaced. There was extensive discussion within BP about what the dangers were and how much it would cost to replace it. And at one point in 2004, the company actually in London received a report from the plant's manager warning that workers were afraid to go to work. There was a document that said that the company might kill someone within the next 12 to 18 months if they didn't replace equipment. BP emails that I obtained show that the company declined to invest $150,000 at the time to replace a piece of this equipment called a blowdown drum. One day, the refinery operations were underway, and the fuel spilled out of the top of this tower that refines gasoline and should have been caught by this piece called a blowdown drum. It wasn't. It sprayed into the sky and was caught by a spark, and it was a massive explosion, and 15 workers died. At the time, it was one of the largest industrial accidents in United States history, and it was followed up by many of the same things that we've seen after the Gulf spill. Government investigations, internal BP investigations, extensive engineering reports, all finding, as we're now familiar with, a series of missteps, a series of poor decisions, and a real depth of cognizance on part of the company before the accident happened.
Going to the current catastrophe, BP's claims fund is administered by Washington lawyer Kenneth Feinberg, who also handled similar fund for victims of 9/11 attacks. Feinberg defended the amount paid by the fund so far.
There's never been anything like this. Over 1 million claims in a year and a half. Compounding the volume problem, the quantification problem, is the qualitative problem. Are claims eligible from Mexico or Norway or Washington, D.C. or Boston? Are claims eligible when they're filed not by fishermen or shrimpers or hotels, but by dentists, chiropractors, veterinarians, everybody in good faith, blaming the spill for their damage?
Abrahm Lustgarten, what about the settlement? The documents are just coming out in the last few days.
Well, there's certainly reason to believe that in some cases the system's been abused. You could call BP a victim in some of those cases. It's also quite positive that BP has invested the way it has, both in cleanup and in restitution for victims in this way. Those are all important contributions that BP has made after this disaster. I do think they have to be seen in the context of the amount of revenues and the $26 billion in profits that BP is also reporting in 2011. Something that one of the EPA investigators who's worked with BP in the past described to me as just a cost of doing business at this point. But certainly BP is spending a very, very large amount of money on its settlements and on the restitution programs along the Gulf Coast.
Dahr Jamail, comment on the deal that has been struck.
Well, more updated. Feinberg's on his way out because so many people across the region are incensed at the way he's handled most of the claims. And he claims that, okay, BP's paid out more than 1 million claims, is I think what he said. He doesn't add, of course, that the vast majority of those claims are quick pay, meaning that they went across the coast, blanketed the coast with the going up to people filing individual claims and said, okay, an individual claim will pay you $5,000, and then that's done, and you sign here and promise not to sue. And so that is the majority of those claims. If you had a business, it was $25,000 and a promise not to sue. The third option that BP gave people was, we'll see you in court, and of course, with the funding they have and the lawyers they have, that would be quite the feat. So, when you talk to the people across the Gulf Coast, you're not going to find a lot of people that are really happy with the type of compensation and the claims that BP is giving out. I mean, I talked to Ryan Lambert, who heads one of the largest charter fishing businesses in the entire Southeast, and he said, hey, we're going to court. They have destroyed my business. It's not coming back. I haven't seen one single speckled trout in 3 months. It's the first time I've ever experienced that in my life. That's 90% of the fish that we catch. So, of course, I'm going to go to court because what they offered me, frankly, was insulting. And I've heard that story from fishermen, shrimpers, seafood business owners up and down the coast. The vast majority of the people I've spoken with down there are displeased, to put it very diplomatically, at the way that BP has handled compensation.
Also, interestingly, an organization that's very much been in the news now, the nonprofit status of ALEC being challenged, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's pushed conservative legislation partnering corporate executives with legislators around the United States at both the state and the national level. BP is a part of the American Legislative Exchange Council, while many corporations in the last few weeks have pulled out, from McDonald's to Wendy's to the Gates Foundation. BP is still there, along with other oil giants. And one of the laws that they are pushing through around the country are laws that against dealing with global warming and that deal with limiting the Environmental Protection Agency. Dahr or Abrahm, can either of you comment on this?
Well, That would be an interesting turn, because one of the things that BP has said for many, many years, and this goes back to their former CEO, John Brown, again, is that they acknowledge the importance of global warming and that they think that the oil industry, that the hydrocarbon industry has a role to play in addressing it. I mean, this was one of the key things that made John Brown famous, and one of the key things that led to the rebranding, or was a product of the rebranding of BP as we know it, changing from British Petroleum to this idea of beyond petroleum, was this extraordinary acknowledgement of the impact of climate change. I haven't heard a lot about BP being involved in lobbying against climate change, but that would be a really stark contrast with their previous positions. At worst, they've remained silent at times, but I haven't seen them be actively against climate change efforts.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Abrahm Lustgarten, environmental reporter with ProPublica. His latest book is called Run to Failure, BP and the Making of the Deepwater Horizon Disaster. And thanks so much to Dahr Jamail, who is joining us from Doha, Qatar, from the studios of Al Jazeera, has been reporting for Al Jazeera on the BP oil spill. This is Democracy